So I understand this is an embargo news release, so I guess I'm doing this in the afternoon, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being here. In the last 3 weeks, we have seen virtual anarchy in many parts of Canada, massively damaging our economy, killing thousands of jobs, jeopardizing the livelihoods of countless Canadians, and even putting human life at peril with ambulances and medical emergencies being blocked by lawless and illegal protests on critical infrastructure from coast to coast. This is not legitimate and lawful protest. Albertans and Canadians respect our constitutionally protected freedoms of expression, of assembly, and to protest. But blocking railways, roadways, commuter trains, and critical infrastructure is simply and plainly illegal. Not only does it mock the principle of the rule of law, which is what holds us together as the central principle of our democratic society, but it also is inflicting massive damage on the Canadian economy. As I said yesterday, it is clear that the withdrawal of the $20 billion Tech Frontier Mine project was linked to the chaos that we have seen in parts of Canada over the past couple of weeks. And I have spoken to major prospective investors who have withdrawn or canceled multi-billion-dollar projected investments in Canada, in part because of the appearance of an inability for Canada to govern itself along our critical infrastructure in particular. The Canadian National Railway was a part of the national dream, as was the CPR, to unite this country with a ribbon of steel, being able to move people and goods from coast to coast. It has been the backbone, these railways have been the backbone of our economy for over 140 years. Their impairment means that billions of dollars of products are backing up. Our ports on both the east and west coast are virtually immobilized. Shippers are moving from Canadian ports to U.S. ports. Alberta farmers can, in too many cases, not get their grain loaded. And if this carries on, it will have devastating impacts on our economy here in Alberta and the rest of the country. Albertans will not tolerate this kind of lawless mockery of our democratic principles and this attack on our nation's and our province's prosperity. That is why today the government of Alberta has introduced in the legislature Bill number 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, which imposes stiff new penalties on lawbreakers who purposefully block critical, essential infrastructure such as railways, roadways, telecommunication lines, utilities, oil and gas production and refinery sites, pipelines, and related infrastructure. It does so by imposing stiff new penalties, which include fines of up to $25,000 for the first and subsequent offenses, or a term of imprisonment of up to 6 months or both. And for corporations that are involved in such activities, because a corporation is in a legal sense a person, a minimum fine of up to $200,000 that could be imposed. If passed, the legislation will create an offense for, without lawful right, justification, or excuse, willfully entering on any essential infrastructure, including entering with permission obtained under false pretenses, willfully destroying or damaging essential infrastructure, willfully obstructing, interrupting, or interfering with the construction, maintenance, use, or operation of any essential infrastructure, rendering the essential infrastructure dangerous, useless, inoperative, or ineffective. We trust our professional police services to, once the legislature has passed this law, to use this as an additional tool to maintain public safety, to maintain respect for the rule of law, to protect critical public infrastructure, and to protect jobs and the economy here in Alberta. Doug?
Thank you, Premier, and thank you everyone for being here today. Over the last number of weeks, we've seen growing lawlessness across the country. We've seen our railway lines grind to a halt. This is simply unacceptable. It is a mockery of our democratically founded country. So we here in Alberta are taking decisive action to respond to this with the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. These things, we're going to end the lawless blockades in our province, which jeopardizes public safety. As the Premier has already highlighted, the focus of this legislation is going to be on pipelines, oil and gas production, refinery sites, highways, railways, dams, bridges, electric, gas, and water facilities, and telecommunication lines. It's important for us to maintain confidence across our province that these are going to remain open for business, that we're going to make sure that we protect these important aspects of our infrastructure so Albertans know that our economy will continue to function. The Premier has already highlighted the nature of the offences that we're going to be targeting. One other thing that we want to highlight as well is that each day one of these illegal protests or blockades continues would be a new offence. So these fines would compound over time. Each day is a new offence under this legislation. So we want to send a clear signal that this will not be tolerated. Day one has a certain minimum fine as well. We've built in minimum fines into this act to send a clear signal that we are not going to tolerate this. We want to make sure that these people know that each day that this goes on, the fines and the ramification goes up. They also face jail time of up to 6 months in the province of Alberta for taking on this type of unlawful activity. So we want to send that clear signal. Not in Alberta, not now, not ever. We've taken a different approach in our province than other justice ministers across this country. We're calling on justice ministers across this country to take a new approach to justice, to make sure that they are vocal in their displeasure with these types of protests, to make sure that they also hopefully enact similar legislation across from coast to coast. We're calling on the Federal Minister of Justice as well and the Federal Public Safety Minister to take decisive action. Stop hiding on this, take decisive action, follow our lead, introduce your own legislation within your own federal jurisdiction to take swift, decisive action to end this lawlessness across our country. Thank you.
Thank you, and I should also point out that well, I'll just leave it at that to say, of course, today we've also presented the Huron Lieutenant Governor presented the throne speech, which is focusing once again on jobs, the economy, and pipelines, and in particular announces that our government will be coming forward in the days ahead with our blueprint for jobs, with a number of new initiatives focused on job creation and economic growth. And there's a number of important democratic reforms also underscored in the throne speech, including the forthcoming introduction of a citizens' initiative referendum bill, which will allow Albertans democratically to force a referendum vote on issues of public importance, guaranteeing that ordinary Albertans will have their voice on critical issues if elected leaders are not listening to them. Also, a recall act that will allow Albertans to force their MLAs, mayors, municipal councillors, or school board trustees to be removed from office if they betray the trust of their voters in between elections. This is a very important and democratic reform tool that Albertans have long asked for. They will receive that through legislation introduced during this session. The legislation, the throne speech also speaks to a number of important fair deal issues, including the legislation that will be forthcoming to create an Alberta Parole Board, withdrawing from our agreement with the Federal Parole Board with respect to provincial inmates. And we await the completion of the Fair Deal panel in March for the government to determine which other measures we'll be taking under our fight for a fair deal in the Canadian Federation. Happy to take your questions.
Premier, I wanted to get you on something that you mentioned yesterday. You said that you had multiple conversations with the CEO from Tech regarding his concerns about public safety and how that was going to be cited at his release on Sunday. So did that conversation happen Saturday night when he phoned you?
We had two conversations. We had a call on Saturday evening and a call on Sunday evening. And in both instances, he stressed that their decision had been rendered in part because of, quotes, public safety concerns.
To pull out from this application process?
Yes.
Minister, will this bill affect how fast the government can respond to, say, blockades? So, for example, CN had to go get an injunction to, of course, it not be necessary, but will they still have to go get an injunction under this, or other than the fines, which is, take it substantial, will it be faster response to this?
Yes, we're building into this parameters to help streamline the process for law enforcement to be able to enforce the law. I'd actually argue that an injunction wasn't even required in this most recent situation. Sometimes a company takes their own measures to help get clarity and help make sure that law is enforced. This will help provide greater clarity for law enforcement to take timely action.
So under this bill, a private corporation will not have to go to court now.
That's correct.
Police can move in at any time.
I'll just supplement that, say, the kinds of offenses that we're addressing with enhanced provincial penalties here are already against the law. You can't go and stand in a highway and put dangerous debris on a railway. This does not require, like, I think we've suddenly in the last 3 weeks begun to think that that the law is made on a case-by-case basis by the courts through injunctions. That is not the case. These kinds of acts are all already against the criminal code. And what this does is to add enhanced provincial penalties. But if there is an injunction, that's always a possibility for the Crown or for relevant businesses or municipalities or other people with standing to go before a court and seek an injunction that effectively compels the police to enforce the law. And then if there is a violation of that injunction, then there can be an additional penalty for contempt of court.
Sorry, just to follow up on that. So I guess the idea then is to tell people there are more penalties than there were before to try and maybe make them think twice. And if they actually do go ahead, then you can move faster with a heavier hammer?
Correct. And to be clear, these kinds of illegal protests on critical public infrastructure are already illegal, but apparently that those disincentives have not been strong enough for some people. We are using, look, Alberta does not have criminal law power, obviously, but we are using the powers that we do have to create summary offenses of this nature with penalties, with administrative fines, with potential jail time, to say that we're giving police and prosecutors additional tools to crack down on illegal blockages of critical infrastructure, and we're adding to the disincentive for that kind of lawlessness with the power that we have under Alberta legislation.
Under trespassing, it would be like currently it's trespassing, right? So what penalties would someone face for a trespassing offense, just to compare with what you guys are proposing here in this bill?
Oh, well, on private property trespassing, we introduced a whole bunch of legislation last session. This builds on similar principles from that. You'll see in the bill that the one distinct difference is that this one has a minimum fine that's built into it, and as well as every single day that it continues, it's a new offense. So we've built in some other principles into this to help send a clear signal that not in Alberta do not do this type of activity.
But it was just a simple, if it was just a regular trespassing violation, what would the fines be? Would it be what you introduced last fall, or is it under the criminal code? Would there be?
The criminal code is separate federal legislation. Under provincial legislation, we have, the bills that we introduced last session were around trespassing, which has the fines, it clearly sets out the fines up to $10,000. This situation here, the fines go up to $10,000 in the first instance, and then on subsequent instances, which actually could be day two, goes up to $25,000. So these are stronger than what we have right now in the province of Alberta. It builds on the foundation of what we passed last session. And again, it's sending a clear signal. We want property rights as respected. We're going to defend our critical infrastructure in Alberta.
So on the first day, a bunch of people are standing on the tracks. You can fine each one of them $1,000 on the first day.
You could fine them up to $10,000 on the first day.
And then up to $25,000 on the second and subsequent days.
Correct. And they could face jail time of up to 6 months each. Correct.
All right, we're just going to go to the phones really quick, please. Operator, can you put through the first caller?
Yeah, first question is from Rick Bell with the Calgary Sun. Rick, your line is open.
I just have one question about tech and one question about Bill 1. The question about tech is that to the Premier, given the fact that yesterday you talked about Tech's exit being at least in part because they knew there was going to be a delay of their project, you had said a few weeks ago that if Tech didn't go ahead, the reaction from the government would be, quote, swift and serious. What swift and serious thing is the government going to do to get the attention of the feds on what has happened with this tech project?
Rick, just a small correction. What I said was that if the Trudeau government vetoed the project, that our response would be swift and serious. They did not veto the project. Unfortunately, I think they did contribute to the circumstances where the tech mining company pulled the application because of an obvious delay that was going to occur. Now, Rick, I actually believe that based on my conversations with the federal government, that they were open to a prospective endorsement of the application, to an approval of the application. They were asking, they're going to seek more time. It's clear to everyone that they were going to delay this for a matter of months, in part because of the current political context around resource issues. And they wanted to get into a bigger conversation with us about energy and environmental issues. A conversation that we've been trying to have with them since the day we were elected in April of last year. So I believe there was a potential way forward to get to a federal yes on the Frontier mine, but the delay contributed to the mining company killing the project. Yesterday we saw the action that this government is taking in the decision of the Alberta Appeal Court, historic 4-1 majority decision, striking down the imposition of the federal carbon tax in Alberta. And we will be fighting that all the way to the Supreme Court. We are not relenting. Yesterday I affirmed that we will be bringing forward a citizen initiative referendum law. Yesterday I affirmed, as the throne speech does today, that our government will use every tool available to us to ensure a future for our energy industry. And we are prepared in our time to do as Peter Lougheed did in his, to, if absolutely necessary, be a financial partner with the industry to ensure that there is a path forward. And we are taking a very broad view of that. So, in other words, if there are commercial proponents of projects like the Frontier mine who are not willing to proceed because of political risk that has been created in part by bad Ottawa policies, then we in principle are in some cases willing to step forward to ensure that such projects proceed. So those are some of the measures that we have signaled. We have to do work on that, obviously. We're not going to risk tax dollars through improvisation. We are going to be very deliberate about what we do to provide a financial path forward for jobs and the energy sector.
You have a follow-up, Rick?
Just supplementary, because of what you said, I think I'll use it on tech as well. So are you saying, you seem to be saying, well, the Trudeau government may, depending on the circumstances, have approved it. So what should Albertans feel about the Trudeau government's role or lack of role now that you've told us what you've told us? For instance, there's going to be a House of Commons emergency debate tonight on the issue of tech. So should Albertans be upset or angry or miffed or not?
Yes.
Is it fair or unfair to be so, given the fact that you say that the feds were open to a yes?
Well,
is that what you're saying, that they were at least open to a yes?
I believe I believe it was possible to get to a yes, but I believe that the company withdrew its application because of uncertainty that was in part created by the delays. The point I made yesterday, I will reiterate. There never should have been delays. This should have been an automatic federal affirmation of the decision of the Joint Regulatory Panel that went through an exhaustive 9-year process in which the company spent over $1 billion, through which all 14 local First Nations entered into benefit agreements. My point was that, yes, I believe there was a possible way to get to a yes, but there was also a very real possibility of a federal veto, and there was the certainty of a delay. That delay, that uncertainty is part of a trend that killed the $40 billion Petronas LNG project, the largest proposed direct foreign investment in Canadian history. That delay and uncertainty is what killed the $8 billion Energy East project, which would have achieved the dream of energy independence. That tendency to politicize the regulatory process is what killed the Northern Gateway pipeline. Those delays and regulatory uncertainty under this government is what caused Kinder Morgan to flee Canada, leaving taxpayers holding the bag on the Trans Mountain expansion. That regulatory uncertainty and delay is what led ultimately to the Frontier decision. So yes, I say that the federal government bears at least partial responsibility for this. The point is we were willing to bend over backwards, to work constructively with them, to do what was necessary to get with a yes, and we proved that in the dying days of the project by signing unqualified agreements with the two most local First Nations, the Mikisew Cree, and the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. So we did our part, and I don't believe Ottawa did its part.
Operator, so we're just going to do one more from the phones. Operator, can you put through the next caller, please?
Yes, next question is from Don Braid with the Calgary Herald. Don, your line is open.
Premier, how will you do these investments? Is it going to be done case by case? Are you going to set up an agency, or are you going to do it through Indigenous opportunities?
All of the above.
And I presume that you're talking about ownership stakes in cases where perhaps there's just one more little push needed to get a project actually on the road or under construction. Could you give us more detail on how this would be done? And do you have anything in mind to start with?
The answer is all of the above, and yes, we have something in mind to start with. I can tell you that with respect to the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, in order to finalize those agreements with Mikisew Cree, the Mikisew Cree and the Athabasca Chipewyan nations, we offered in principle to extend backstop from the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation in the quantum of several $100 million. That would have been a risk taken by the government of Alberta to facilitate First Nations ownership or co-ownership, I should say, an equity role in the project to help us get to a yes on it. That's one example. There is a significant project that we've been working on for some time that I alluded to yesterday, where we are looking at a financial role for a essential major project. There will be news to follow on that in the weeks to come. In light of these recent developments, we are looking to the example of the Lockheed government in the 1970s. It is well known that the entire commercial genesis of the Alberta oil sands began in part with the Lockheed government's creation of the Alberta Energy Company, which was a partner with Syncrude in the initial development of the oil sands. At a time when we could not get adequate access to capital to develop the third largest oil reserves on Earth, the government of Alberta played a critical role until that was no longer necessary. Well, it may be necessary again, and Dom, one of the possible approaches would be to recreate an agency or a corporation similar to the AEC in the 1970s.
Do you have a follow-up, Don?
Well, in that case, people happily snapped up shares and made a lot of money. Even cabinet ministers could hold shares.
They didn't have today's ethics laws back then.
Do their best to make money out of it. Would you foresee something like that going to the public for some of the financing?
Absolutely. In fact, in our initial internal conversations, we were considering exactly that kind of model. One difference would be they didn't have rigorous ethics legislation and conflict legislation in those days. So Doug and I will not end up owning any shares, or should we create such an entity. But I think public participation is a great idea. And I think Albertans are smart, they're patriotic, they understand that there's great value in these resources as there are increasing barriers to accessing capital. Here's the point we're ascending on. We will not be stopped. This province will not be shut down. We will not leave in the ground assets that represent $10 trillion of value on global markets. we will not be the only of the major energy producers in the world to choose poverty over prosperity.
Tom?
Bill number one, you talked about, obviously, blocking railways is unacceptable in this bill. What about something like last year's convoy that tied up the Henday for a couple hours or out of Nisku? Would that fall under this legislation as well, something like that?
So it'll include bridges, highways, roads, all critical infrastructure. You'll see in Bill number one the expansive definitions that we've used based off of other pieces of legislation to make sure that we have the critical infrastructure of Alberta covered off.
So something like convoys would be deemed as unacceptable because it could tie up a highway then?
No, we want to make sure, again, you have to use discretion on the ground for police to use their discretion as they see fit. But again, it will cover off highways, bridges, roads, and such.
You've channeled the Lougheed era for this, just to
Initiative.
underscore this initiative. But the last time Alberta was in the business of business was really kind of the Getty years, wasn't it? And I mean, it's a bit different, I know, pulp and paper and stuff, but I mean, that's got a lot of financial purposes in it.
Listen, I was hanging around this press gallery in the very early 1990s, objecting strenuously to some of those decisions of the Getty government. I'm not talking about replicating we learned the lesson that about through exposure on things like MagCan and the cell phone company and the I mean there were the Gainers project. I think there was about $8 billion of taxpayers' money that was lost through loans, grants, and guarantees in that period. In I think a well-intentioned but misguided effort to advance diversification of the Alberta economy. I'm talking about a different period and initiative. I'm talking about the early mid-1970s, when the Lougheed government realized we had this enormous asset. Until then, Alberta's energy production had been entirely in the conventional basin, but then we realized that through the emerging technology, it could be developed. It was very capital intensive, and the banks down east and international investors were not willing to take the risk. Peter Lougheed made a strategic decision that the government of Alberta was, and I think we can all agree in retrospect, it was the right decision. We have generated, I'm sure, north of $100 billion of government revenue and countless jobs as a result of that strategic decision. And so, look, this is not the 1970s. There are different times and different challenges, but there is at least one similarity. We have a growing challenge in getting access to capital, partly because of politics, and so I believe that we need to look at how we can ensure future access to capital on reasonable terms that protect the interests of Alberta taxpayers.
I suspect there might be some industries, like, for example, you got rid of the incentives for tech and you made your arguments for that. But I suspect there's some quarters that would like to see you take this kind of initiative to diversify other parts of Alberta's economy, especially the tech economy.
Our blueprint for jobs will speak to other measures to support and advance diversification. That is very critical. But our ability to continue diversifying the economy depends on our maintaining a vibrant energy sector. It is the massive investments in research development, science and technology, sponsorship of academic research through our energy sector that has helped to create a tech sector. It has helped to create green tech innovations in this province. So I've always believed that the energy sector is not a barrier to diversification, but fully realizing its value is the critical path to diversification. Graham?
Sorry. On the issue of tech, back to tech, and I can see you're frustrated with what's happened with that. Prosper Petroleum. What's happening with that? Now, the court said make a decision. Why the delay?
Well, you know what, Graham? I'm just not going to comment on that for the sub judice convention because this is before the courts. We are appealing the decision of the Queen's Bench in that respect. I will just point out that there are competing interests from proximate First Nations, and we hope that we'll be able to get to an understanding between the different parties, and that's all I will say. Il y a une question en français?
S'il vous plaît, c'est votre projet de loi 1. Vos projets de loi 1 ont toujours été très symboliques. C'est un projet quand même, vous avez vous-même parlé d'un outil pour un crackdown. Alors, pourquoi c'est ce message-là que vous avez choisi à l'orée d'une nouvelle session législative?
Dans les 3 dernières semaines, nous avons vu presque l'anarchie sur les chemins de fer, les autoroutes et l'autre infrastructure essentielle partout au Canada, y compris ici en Alberta. Et ça nuit énormément à l'économie canadienne. Ça a tué dizaines de milliers d'emplois. Et si ça continue, ça serait une attaque grave contre la prospérité économique du Canada. C'est la raison pour laquelle nous allons agir avec le projet de loi 1 pour protéger l'infrastructure essentielle avec les peines beaucoup plus sévères selon la loi provinciale contre ceux qui font les manifestations illégales sur l'infrastructure essentielle, comme les chemins de fer, comme les autoroutes. Alors, c'est une nouvelle utile pour les forces policières de protéger l'infrastructure et la sécurité publique et notre économie.
En même temps, il n'y en a pas eu tant que ça, des blocages en Alberta, là. Et comment est-ce que vous pensez que le fait de durcir les sanctions va dissuader des gens, alors qu'on a vu en Ontario que la police est intervenue, il y a eu des arrestations, puis les barricades, elles sont toujours là. Alors pourquoi punir ça, c'est la solution?
Écoutez, c'est exactement parce qu'on a vu les manifestations illégales sans conséquences. Et je crois qu'il y a des gens qui croient qu'il n'y a pas de conséquences graves s'ils font ces choses. Alors, il faut souligner que dans certains cas, nous avons vu les policiers qui ont mis en vigueur les lois et les ordres des cours contre les manifs illégaux. Et nous voulons souligner avec ce projet de loi qu'ici, en Alberta, nous aurons les peines les plus graves au Canada contre ces gestes illégaux.
Which law enforcement agencies did you consult about this, and what did they have to say about it?
We're in the process today of working with different law enforcement agencies. Obviously, the developments across Canada required a quick response in developing out Bill 1. We did have the benefit of having some consultation with law enforcement agencies regarding previous legislation that we introduced that I referenced earlier on, bolstering property rights, and we've built on that in this legislation.
Folks, I'm late for another function. Thank you very much, and see you later on today. Thank you.